We are live. Beautiful. Hello, I'm Chelsea, and welcome to Space Chat. For those of you who haven't been here before, this is the weekly live show where I fill you in on all that's happening in space and science and answer your questions live. Now, because we are live, I'm going to give everyone a second or two to join us on the live video before I dive into what has been new in space this week. If you follow space at all, you probably know it's been quite the week. So without further ado, I think I'm just going to dive into things. Now, I say this pretty much every week, that space is a busy place, and truly this week was no exception. This week got off to quite the start when on Monday, the 7 astronauts and cosmonauts on the International Space Station had to take emergency shelter in their respective Dragon and Soyuz vehicles, the spacecraft that they flew to space that are now docked at the station, basically leaving the main station and taking refuge in their spacecraft. Now, the crew sheltered in place as the space station passed through a cloud of space debris. Now, in space, even a tiny piece of space debris, if traveling at about 17,000 miles per hour, can do a lot of serious damage to something like the space station. Now, the station orbits around Earth every 90 minutes, so that meant that every 90 minutes, the space station was passing through this cloud of dangerous debris. So where did the debris come from? Well, that's what's caused such a fuss. In fact, as it was confirmed by the United States State Department and the Pentagon later on Monday, the cloud of debris, which was made of about 1,500 trackable pieces or big enough to track pieces, and hundreds of thousands of additional pieces of space debris, was created by a Russian anti-satellite missile test. Basically, to put it very simply, Russia blew up one of its old satellites in a similar altitude to the International Space Station. The test targeted a defunct Soviet satellite that was, again, at a not too distant altitude from the station. Now, while Russia, along with other countries, including the US, including India and China, have anti-satellite test capabilities and have conducted anti-satellite or ASAT tests, this was a little bit different. Russia's previous tests with this system have been at much lower altitudes and basically not at real targets. This test is referred to as an intercept because the test missile actually collided with a satellite. Previously, experts think that, they were probably just testing their technology, suborbital flights, much lower altitudes, things like that. But this time, they actually hit a satellite. And there are so many existing and possible future consequences from not only the fact that they hit a satellite, but the fact that it was at such a high altitude. Obviously, the first big deal was that this altitude was so similar to the space station. So the most immediate consequence was in the risk and danger that it posed to both the astronauts and the Russian cosmonauts on the space station. There's been speculation about why Russia chose to target this specific satellite, and it just happened this week. So there's probably going to be a lot happening before anything is really fully figured out and action is taken. However, being at that altitude, it did put the station and its human inhabitants in immediate danger. But it wasn't just this immediate danger that people are worried about. In fact, because it's at this altitude, it's thought that the pieces of debris created by this test could be in space for years and years to come. In fact, experts have said that it's likely that it could be maybe 5 or so years and only a big percentage of the pieces will come back down and burn up in the atmosphere. That a lot of those smaller pieces, that a lot of the pieces might remain. In fact, there's still a ton of space debris left over from higher altitude anti-missile tests from the Soviet Union over 50 years ago. And China did an ASAT test in 2007. Again, at a higher altitude, and there is still space debris 14 years later stuck in space. So not only is this a space junk issue, and we talk about polluting, crowding outer space, but this is a serious safety risk for crewed missions going to and from the station, for the astronauts living on the station, the cosmonauts living on the station, and for working satellites. Russia targeted a satellite that hasn't worked in decades, but there are still satellites in orbit that, if they were to collide at a little piece of metal going 17,000 miles per hour, that could pose a pretty serious issue and could seriously damage that technology. The U.S. State Department called Russia's anti-satellite test a dangerous and irresponsible act. And so far, countries around the world, as well as major space companies like Virgin Orbit, have spoken out against it. In fact, NASA's administrator issued a statement about the events. He said, Bill Nelson, he said, "I'm outraged by this irresponsible and destabilizing action. With its long and storied history in human spaceflight, it is unthinkable that Russia would endanger not only the American and international partner astronauts on the ISS, but also their own cosmonauts." So this is a big deal. The US and Russia have had a many decades-long working relationship in space, with American astronauts going to space aboard Russian Soyuz capsules for years and years, and working together, living together aboard the space station, the countries collaborating in a multitude of ways. However, this event, being that it did, endanger human life and create possible risks in orbit for not just humans, but technology, it is quite a big deal. And it is interesting to think how it will affect the relationship between the two nations and their collaboration and space progress in general in the years to come. So yes, pretty big deal. Now, the space station's astronauts and cosmonauts have since very recently resumed normal operations, but there will still be this lasting damage and this lasting risk and concern for years to come. Now, moving on a little bit from this most dramatic space moment of the week. Again, Space Chat, you can ask questions at any time. So anytime while I'm talking, drop your questions down in the chat below. When I get to the Q&A portion of Space Chat, I read back through all of them, so you can post them at any time. But moving on a little bit from all of the drama, this week also saw something very exciting for skywatchers. Last night, or very early this morning, depending on where you are in the world, was the Beaver Moon lunar eclipse, the longest lunar eclipse of its kind in 580 years. Now, if you were lucky enough to see the eclipse, please let me know down in the comments below. I would love to know what your experience was like. If you've seen a lunar eclipse before, what that experience was like for you. And if you've got any great photos, space.com, we love to see everyone's amazing sky watching photos. Sadly, where I am located, it was a little too cloudy and foggy to see much of anything. But eclipses are always a great excuse to get your friends into sky watching, to learn a little bit more about the night sky, about things like the moon. So if you were able and lucky enough to catch a glimpse, I'd love to hear about it. Now, moving on, this upcoming week, we will see a spacecraft launch out millions of miles into the solar system to smash into an asteroid on purpose. This is NASA's mission called the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART for short. The mission will launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket late at night, about 10:20 p.m. on November 23rd Pacific time, or about 1:20 Eastern time. For those tuning into the live stream or hearing about it or learning about it from afar. So it's going to be a pretty late night launch. And basically, this test is NASA essentially practicing for what it might do in case of an asteroid impact emergency. So currently, there are no large asteroids that NASA knows of that are on trajectory with Earth that are going to recreate any kind of asteroid disaster, sci-fi danger. However, in the future, if there were to be a large asteroid that posed a significant threat to impact Earth and cause harm, NASA wants to be prepared. It wants to have proven that it has the technology that can deal with the situation. So this test is going to do that. It's going to go millions and millions of miles out to a 2-asteroid system. In this system, there's a fairly large asteroid named Didymos, and orbiting around that asteroid is a mini moonlit asteroid, a tiny little space rock. Well, tiny by space standards, named Dimorphos. And Dimorphos orbits around Didymos, and the spacecraft will go out and crash almost head on into that mini moonlit asteroid. And NASA isn't just doing this for fun. What they're aiming for is to alter the moonlit asteroid's orbit around the bigger asteroid, to alter its orbit, to change its direction, to change where and how it's orbiting. Their goal is to shorten its orbit by several minutes. Now, there's no reason why they would want its orbit to be shorter. Again, neither of these asteroids poses any risk or any threat or danger to Earth at all. Even if the test doesn't go perfectly, they pose no risk to Earth at all. However, this is basically to prove the technology works. So they need to prove that they can take a spacecraft, smash it into an asteroid, and change its path and accurately predict how they're going to change its course, right? So in the future, if there was some big asteroid on its way to Earth, that they would be able to send out a big version of DART and smash into that asteroid and smash it into a different direction and be able to accurately estimate the new direction that they will set it on to make sure that they will be getting Earth out of harm's way. So this is a really exciting test. Planetary defense is really, only something we have to be concerned about in the worst case scenario, but we want to have the technology available and also proven to work if something were to happen. Thankfully, we are not in any kind of extreme sci-fi level danger, but it is important that we have that technology because, the universe is unpredictable. And experts have estimated that we only really have about 30 to 40% of the large asteroids near Earth categorized and completely identified so far. So there's still a lot of work to do in identifying what's close to Earth. So just in case there's something that we have not spotted that could pose a risk to Earth, we are going to be prepared. So that's been kind of what's new in space and what to look forward to next week. Now we get to my favorite part of Space Chat, which is, of course, answering your questions. So if you have not gotten the opportunity to ask a question yet in the chat below and you'd like to, drop a comment down below, any question, comment, and concern, and I'm going to turn now to those questions and get through as many of them as I possibly can. All right. Ooh, nice. YouTube. I'm a flat earther. Are you sure what's being stated is correct and as possible? I am 1000% sure. I could not be more sure, but thank you for checking with me. I appreciate that. Okay, Faisal on YouTube, is there an explanation for why some galaxies appear in spirals and how many there are? That's a really great question. So there are different types of galaxies, but ones like ours that we are most familiar with are spiral galaxies. But that doesn't mean that they're the only type of galaxy out there. That's just kind of what we're familiar with, and also what is really visually exciting. So if people want to share photos or images of galaxies, they oftentimes choose a spiral galaxy because it looks really cool and they're really interesting to study. But that doesn't mean that they are the only ones out there. Okay, YouTube, is this space junk free falling around the Earth? Not exactly, no. So space junk, there is some space junk that is basically stuck in low Earth orbit around Earth, basically stuck in orbit. But over time, those pieces, depending on how high their altitude is, will get closer and closer and fall towards Earth. But space junk is small, right? Even whole satellites are pretty small, and most space junk are tiny little chunks of old satellites. So it's very small pieces. So space junk, almost every single time when it falls to Earth, it burns up almost immediately in Earth's atmosphere, basically disintegrating almost immediately. So yes, there is space junk that free falls to Earth, but it doesn't fall to Earth's surface. It falls into our atmosphere where it burns up. But interesting question. Okay. Interesting question, Bogdan on YouTube. What happens if somebody dies on the space station? So thankfully, this has never happened before. No one has ever died on the space station, to my knowledge. I'm pretty positive on that one. But there there are definitely plans in place. I remember, I forget who I was talking to about this, but I mean, there are discussions on what to do if something were to go wrong, something unexpected, something that could not be prevented, and someone happened to lose their life on the space station. I think it would depend on if the astronaut was a NASA astronaut, if they came from a different space agency, if they were a private astronaut, perhaps a space tourist, because different agencies, companies, etc., would have different ways of dealing with the situation. But it's a really interesting thing to think about. And then we also have to think about going to the moon with Artemis, and in the future going to Mars. What happens when someone dies on Mars? What happens when someone dies on the moon? Mars doesn't have an atmosphere like Earth where things would even break down biologically in the same way. So it's interesting to think about how we as humans would deal with that situation when essentially, from what I understand, a human body that is deceased, left on the surface of Mars, would essentially mummify. It would not break down and decompose as it would on planet Earth. So it's interesting to think, what would we do? I don't know. It's a good question. Right, let's see. All right. Sam Robertson asking about a meteor. I'm not sure which specific meteor you're referring to. I'm not sure what specific meteor you're referring to, but when meteors or fireballs come to Earth, usually we know about it ahead of time, and it's just not made a big deal in the media or news because it doesn't pose a risk to humans. And if you say, "Hey, big meteor falling to Earth," people get really scared because they think it's a big meteor falling to Earth that could hurt them, when in fact it's a fireball burning up in our atmosphere that just kind of looks like a shooting star. But that's an interesting question. May cause humans to develop shields. Not sure what you mean by this. Webb telescope. Yes, actually, a month from yesterday, December 18th, NASA is planning on launching its James Webb Space Telescope, which is to be the most advanced space telescope in history, the most advanced piece of observing equipment, probably hands down across the board. It's going to be launching from French Guiana on an Ariane 5 rocket. So it's going to be really amazing. It's been a really long time coming, many years in the making, many delays. For those of you that have been following Webb, you know that to be true. But yes, less than a month now until Webb launches. Very exciting. Okay. Karen asks on Facebook, is anyone concerned about the possibility of space warfare, how they could take out satellite communications for another nation? Yes. In fact, this is something that the U.S. military and international militaries and nations are discussing and have discussed for many years. In fact, dating back years and years, but even more so now. In fact, for those of you familiar with the U.S. Space Force, that's a major component of the U.S. Space Force. When it was first created, while it is not completely dissimilar to what already existed in the Air Force, people were thinking, space warfare, are these astronauts with, weapons? What's going on here? But the major threat is actually interference with satellites, because satellites, they're how we track wildfires. They're how we communicate with each other. They're how we even use our cell phones day to day. So interfering with another nation's satellite, it could be extremely, extremely dangerous for that nation's citizens. So a huge part of why Space Force exists is to deal with threats on this level, is to deal with the possibility of interference with our satellites. So yeah, that's something that is definitely already on our radar. It's definitely something that is of concern and being considered. Okay. Steve on Facebook asks, using lunar material, could we build a large station for future missions to Mars and beyond? And you mentioned parked at L5. I assume you're talking about the Lagrange point. That's an interesting question. So there has been discussion. There has been actually a lot of research on what we could do with lunar material. Can we 3D print with it? Can we make habitats with it? And it's thought that yes, that it's possible that humans or robots, depending on who we send first to do this specific task, could on the moon use local materials, use that lunar dust, that regolith, to 3D print structures. However, if you're thinking about having that lunar dust structure be in space between the moon and Mars, I do not think it would survive the journey out past the moon, let alone staying in space. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty certain that it would take some additional technology and some additional materials likely so that it could withstand the journey to that point and then staying in that point and supporting humans as a station. I think that would be a pretty big challenge, especially when you consider that humans living in a lunar habitat made entirely of lunar dust, they would have to have some serious spacesuits and protection on because lunar dust actually is pretty carcinogenic to humans. You can't touch it, can't breathe it in. You're not supposed to. It can cause some seriously serious health risks. So there could be some issues in doing that. How powerful is the James Webb Space Telescope? Jesse asks. How far would it be able to see? It's extremely powerful. It's enormous. It's so big that they literally had to fold it up. So the big thing that it's going to do after launching is unfold itself in space. Its giant gold solar array is literally going to have to be folded up and then it's going to have to self-unfold to start working in space. That's how big it is. So it's extremely big. It's extremely powerful. And researchers hope that it's going to be able to use infrared to see very, very far into space and far into the past, essentially. By looking super far into space, researchers can, in some ways, look into the past, look at what things might have been like closer to the Big Bang and kind of discover the origins of galaxies, stars, planets, and have a better understanding of how all of this came to be and to understand things like dark matter and dark energy and how those play a part in our universe, how those played a part in its origins and what they actually might be. So yeah, really exciting piece of equipment. Chris on Facebook, couldn't we catapult capsules into space rather than using the full complement of rockets, perhaps a magnetic track? Interesting. I have not seen catapult technology capable of doing something like this. Catapults usually, they propel things forward because they can only bend back as far as, then they hit the earth. They can't bend back any farther than that. Even if they could, they have an arc motion. So it would have to be a pretty big catapult for that to work. And the G-forces being swung like that as opposed to just the, thrust upward, I'm not sure how a human might react to a absolutely must be enormous, giant, insane catapult. Not sure if that would be better, but I haven't explored the technology fully, so it's an interesting idea. All right. Let's see. All right. Yes. On YouTube, Jeffrey says, any news on the future fate of Hubble? And is it true that James Webb won't be able to do some of the things Hubble can do? Great question. So Hubble had a glitch recently. It had some issues where its science instruments got turned off so that researchers could explore what went wrong. And they're still trying to figure it out. Now, Hubble's instruments are piece by piece coming back on, but they're still trying to figure out what went wrong. Hubble's had a lot of glitches over the years, but they're confident that we will be getting Hubble back on track. Now, to the second part of your question, yes, Hubble and James Webb, while both big space telescopes, they observe differently, right? James Webb is very different from all other similar scopes because it observes in infrared. So it's not going to be observing like how we think of a telescope as just looking at a thing. It's going to be detecting infrared light. So I'm not sure exactly what kind of images we'll get out of it, if they'll look quite as spectacular as Hubble's incredible imagery. However, by looking at infrared light, it will allow the scope to see farther out into space. So it's much more powerful, but it looks differently. It has a different set of lenses. It doesn't do things the same way. So it is more powerful, but it's not a direct successor to Hubble. They do slightly different things, but that is a really, really great question. All right. And with that, this has been Space Chat. Thank you all so much for all of your wonderful